Chapter 54 is going to focus on community ecology. The biological community is when you have populations consisting of different species that are living close enough to interact with one another. In the picture that was on the front slide, you have a sea urchin that is being carried by a carrier crab that is able to protect it against potential predators. Some interactions are helpful, some interactions are harmful, and some interactions have no effect. These interactions between species are referred to as interspecific interactions. You can have competition, predation, herbivory, symbiosis, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and facilitation. These interactions can affect the species' survival and reproduction, and this is not just one species, it's both. So those effects can be summarized with a plus sign for being positive, a negative sign for being negative, or having no effect with a zero. So if you have an interspecific competition, that's when you are competing for a resource that you are limited in. If there is strong competition, it can lead to competitive exclusion. I don't know why I have all that on there twice, which basically results in eliminating one of the two species that is being competed, that you can't have two species coexist in the same place that need the same limited resource. Ecological niches. These are all of a species' biotic and abiotic resources that it needs to use. Um, most species are going to be able to exist together, coexist in a community, if there are differences in their ecological niches. Resource partitioning is a way to distinguish or differentiate between these niches so that you can have species that have similar needs to exist, coexist together in a given community. So here we have two types of lizards. You can see that they are more likely to be found in different locations within that particular community. So realized versus fundamental niches. A fundamental niche is that one that could potentially be occupied. The realized is the actual one. Um, a lot of times it would be great if the fundamental was the realized, but that does not necessarily always take place due to competition. So some examples. Um, the presence of one barnacle species will limit the realized niche of another species. And then we've got common and golden spiny mouses. They have temporal partitioning of their niches. They typically are both nocturnal, but if they happen to be in the same community, the golden spiny mouse will become diurnal, aka active during the day. Character displacement. This is when characteristics tend to be more divergent in sympatric populations than in allopatric populations for the same two species. Remember we talked about allopatric, that's when there was a geographic barrier that caused the species to be separate from one another, while sympatric was just the development of two species in the same general location. So for there to be more divergency in characters for sympatric populations is not what you would typically expect. So we see this with the Galapagos finches with beak size. So here you have G. fuliginosa and G. fortris. They are being separated, or they became species via allopatric speciation. And you can see that the size of their beaks is roughly about the same. And then if you look at them on Santa Maria, San Cristobal, that with you have the sympatric populations, you still have the two. You have the two species, but you will notice the beak depth is much different with the sympatric populations as opposed to the allopatric ones. Predation, positive negative interaction. We're going to see a lot of these positive negative interactions. One species, the predator, kills and eats the prey. Got some adaptations listed there. Prey will have defensive adaptations, behavioral defenses, and then there can also be morphological and physiological adaptations that have occurred over time. Cryptic coloration or camouflage can make your prey difficult to spot. Um, if you are more likely to have pretty good chemical defenses, you will have some bright coloration. You're not trying to hide aposematic coloration because you they want to try and get you. They are not going to be very happy with that outcome. And because of that, when predators see those bright colors, when you see something that's not trying to hide, they tend to be a little more cautious. Some other ways that prey are able to get protection is by mimicking appearances and Batesian mimicry. If you have a species that is more likely to be palatable, is not going to be very harmful to its predator, it mimics one that it would cause harm to that particular predator. In Mullerian mimicry, you have two species that actually are neither one of them are very palatable, and they look a lot like each other. Okay, so there you can barely see the canyon tree frog in the canyon, and there you see the very bright poison dart frog. And then with Batesian, you can see the hawk moth larvae looks similar to the green parrot snake. And then in part D, the cuckoo bee and the yellow jacket have similar colorations. Herbivory. So this is like predator prey, positive, negative again, but this time it's eating plants. So a herbivore eats parts of a plant or algae. The plant has evolved over time, both with mechanical and chemical defenses, to try to protect itself against herbivores. Symbiosis. We're going to look at some different types of symbiosis. Two or more species live in direct and intimate contact with one another, mutualistic, commensalistic, or in the last case, parasitic. And that would be lice on that last picture. Yay, fun. Parasitism, positive negative interaction. Yet again, parasite gets nourishment from the other organism, its host. The host is harmed. You have parasites that live within the host body. They're called endoparasites. And then you have ones like the lice that live on the external surface, ectoparasites. They typically have a more complex life cycle, can have a number of different hosts, and they can sometimes cause changes in the host behavior that would help to increase the parasite's fitness, such as if you have a tapeworm. Mutualism, positive interaction. This is an interaction that's going to benefit both species that are involved. You can have mutualism, which is obligate, where the two species cannot survive without the other, and you can have facultative, where they could both survive on their own. So here you have an acacia tree and ants, and the ants are helping to clear the area at the bottom of that tree. Commensalism. This is a positive zero interaction. You have a species being benefited, and you have the other species that's not being helped or being harmed. These aren't as easy to document because if you have some sort of close association, you're more likely going to impact. But in this particular example, we have the egrets, and they are working with the buffalo. They are able to I had to look this one up because I didn't remember this one. They are able to feed on insects out of the grass that the bison, or in this case the buffalo, are eating. So because the birds are able to get more food from the areas where those are exposed by the buffalo, it's going to be a beneficial relationship. There's also some thought that that might help with the buffalo because they might help take off ticks and things like that. But again, as it said, these are a little bit more difficult to document. Facilitation, plus plus or zero plus. We have these types of interactions when one species is going to have a positive effect on another species, but it doesn't necessarily involve direct contact. So the black rush is able to make soil more hospitable for other plant species. That's a summary of those different interactions. So diversity, trophic structures are going to be used to characterize biological communities. There typically are certain species in a community that are going to have a pretty significant impact on that community structure. So, features of community structure are going to involve the diversity of species that are around as well as their feeding relationships. So, when we look at species diversity, there's two components that are going to make up the variety of organisms that are present in your community. One is your richness, the different numbers of species that are present, and the second is the relative abundance, the relative proportion each species makes up. You can have lots of different species be present, but if you still have the majority being made up by one species, then you're not being as diverse as you could be if you have um, more substantial proportions of different species. So communities can have the same relative amount of species richness, but can have different relative abundances. And you can calculate that using that particular index there. That's a little bit more challenging. So, because counting individual species and the numbers of individual species can be a little bit difficult. So, this is done more hypothetically. So here we have a area in Minnesota where diversity has been manipulated, so we can see how it benefits. Cedar Creek Natural History Area, and what they have been able to ascertain is that communities that have greater amounts of diversity are going to be more productive and more stable. Are able going to be able to withstand and be able to recover from stresses in their environments and are going to be able to deal with invasive species, those that have become established outside of where they are normally found, more effectively. Trophic structure. This is something that you have probably heard about either in life science or when you took your first biology class. Feeding relationships between organisms. So, how communities are able to support themselves plays a role in the dynamics of that community. You can have food chains and you can have food webs. Food chains are more straightforward. Trophic levels are linked from producer to top, from producers to carnivores at the very top. And then food webs are more of branching chains. They recognize that some species are going to be found at multiple trophic levels. So food webs tend to be a little more complicated. You want to group, typically you group within a food web species together that have similar trophic relationships. And it also allows you to kind of isolate communities, portions that don't impact the rest of the community. So here we have food chains, a terrestrial and a marine food chain. And then here we have a food web, and you can see how you have some species that are basically at the same levels, which is what we would see in the food chain, but then you have ones that are going to impact on different levels within this food web. And here's another example of one like that. You can see how the striped bass is kind of staying separate from everything else. So, how do food chains work in terms of their length? They typically aren't super long, and there are two hypotheses that have been used to explain it: the energetic hypotheses and the dynamic stability hypotheses. The energetic hypothesis is that your length is going to be limited based on energy transfer. If you aren't effectively able to transfer energy, then that's going to limit how long your chain is able to get. And that's the one that data typically supports. The dynamic stability just says that longer food chains aren't going to be as stable as shorter ones. And there's data has not backed up that particular hypothesis. Sorry, I said hypotheses earlier. There are species, as I said, that will have a more significant impact on your community. They typically are going to play either key roles or are going to be present in large numbers. Dominant species are the ones that are going to be present in greater amounts or they're going to have larger biomasses. They are, because of their sheer number, they are able to have pretty significant impact on how other species occur and are found within their community. So here we have sugar maples. They play a key role with shading and soil nutrients. So that's going to affect the other plant species that are present. So a couple of hypotheses that yes, this time is plural. A couple hypotheses that have been used to describe how dominant species impact on a community, that they exploit the resources most effectively, or that they are better off at providing at avoiding predation. Invasive species can become a really critical dominant species if they are placed in an environment where they do not have any predators and there are no pathogens that can impact them. Keystone species. These are ones that are not necessarily present in large numbers, but they play a pretty significant role based on their ecological role or their niche. We'll talk about sea otters on the next slide. So, sea stars are able, when they aren't present, there are a couple other members within their community that will blow up in numbers. But when the sea stars are present, they keep everything basically under control. So it's like when you have a reaction and you have a lot of reactants and you want to make products or you've got a source of the product, but you don't have anything to break those reactants down to help generate the in betweens. Yes, I know it's chemistry. Deal with it. I'm sorry. Um, Ecosystem engineers. So the beaver dams, they can transform their ecosystem, their biome, so that that's going to be more beneficial to different types of species depending on how that physical change takes place. So that would be another species that's going to play a key role in your community. And so here we have an example with, I told you we come back to the sea otters. As the sea otter numbers decrease, the sea urchin mass biomass increases. More sea urchins are present. When more sea urchins are present, your kelp amounts decrease. So you're going to have more diversity when you have a larger amount of sea otters present. So there's a couple ways we can look at these. We can look at it from bottom up or we can look at it from top down. We look at it from bottom up, that if we have a lot of nutrients present, or if we are missing a lot of nutrients, that's going to have a significant impact on the community structure as we move up from our producers to our consumers. While if we go from top down, we are saying that the predators are going to have the primary role in determining what happens with the herbivores, which are then going to impact on your primary producers. The top down approach is where biomanipulation has come into play. So it's one way we can help to restore communities that have been polluted. Um, if you have lots of blooms of a primary producer, because one of the primary consumers of that producer have been eaten by a secondary consumer, you could add another consumer that would eat some of the second consumer, and that would help to increase your primary consumer, and then that would help to reduce the primary producer that you started with. So you have lots of the cyanobacteria, and you don't have enough zooplankton to eat up that cyanobacteria, so you're having blooms. You have too much of that being generated. The pike perch are able to control the roachfish populations. And because the roachfish aren't eating the zooplankton anymore, the zooplankton are then there to help to reduce those cyanobacterial blooms. So, what we're going to get into now is succession. Um, Most ecologists a while back thought communities basically were in this equilibrium state, and a climax community would be when things are super stable. And then down the road, a couple other scientists, Tansley and Gleason, came along and weren't necessarily convinced that all communities were found at equilibrium. And evidence has come about that has shown that there is a non equilibrium model in which communities are consistently going through change after they have been disturbed. We talked about disturbances a little earlier. Anything that would change your community, take organisms from it, or alter resources. So, fire is probably one of the most significant disturbances that terrestrial ecosystems can encounter. High levels of disturbance are going to um, have an impacts in one direction. Low levels of disturbance are going to have impacts in one direction, but intermediate disturbance is actually going to result in greater diversity than having it on the other two ends. With high levels of disturbance, you don't have the slow growing species involved. And in low levels of disturbance, the dominant species can kind of take over and exclude those less competitive ones. So it was shown in a New Zealand study that when you had intermediate flooding, you were going to have a greater diversity of invertebrates. Yellowstone National Park, and I'll show you some pictures on the next slide, that when you do have massive disturbances, communities actually can respond pretty quickly. So this would be a particular example of a non-equilibrium community. This was shortly after a fire in Yellowstone, and then that is 1 year later. So again, we're not talking about overnight, but you can see some pretty dramatic changes that have occurred in that 1 year period. So ecological succession is how communities and ecosystems change after a disturbance has taken place. You can have either primary or secondary succession initially. Primary succession is when there is no soil present when the succession process starts. Secondary is when soil was present. You'll have early arriving and late arriving species, how they are connected to one another. Sometimes the early arriving species can help to make the environment more favorable for the later arriving species, or they could make the environment uninhabitable, excuse me, for the later arriving species. Sometimes they might not have any impact on the later arriving species, at least in terms of their environment. They can live there, but they're not going to have any say, or they're not going to provide benefits or disadvantages for that later arriving species in terms of establishing themselves in that succession period. So here's an example with glaciers. So over time, as the moraines in Glacier Bay have changed, when the moraine was exposed, it got colonized by pioneering plants. And one of those plants starts to dominate the plants that are living there in the community. Um, Alder will then come in and form dense thickets. Once the alder is present and has taken over, it gets overgrown by Sitka spruce, western hemlock, mountain hemlock. And part of the reason these changes have occurred is that the vegetation, um, as the vegetation starts to grow up in those different areas, it's going to change the soil pH. It's going to increase the nitrogen, which is going to make that environment more favorable for the other species to come in. So there you see the when I looked at this one, it took me a second. So you're seeing the different stages there, the piner stage, the dryas stage, the alder stage, and the spruce stage. What you're seeing with the map in the middle is how the ice is melting away. So the part where the ice first melted in 1760 is the furthest along in the succession period. So that's where you see the spruces. And then in 1860, that's where you're seeing that where that ice has melted away. That's where you're seeing the alders. The driest stage is the one that first started seeing the ice melt away in 1907. And then the pioneer stage is the one at the very top around 1941. So again, these are not overnight changes, but you can see over time how these different stages of succession have come about. Humans are having the biggest impact on biological communities throughout the world. We tend to reduce species diversity, which is very sad. So, factors that are biogeographic wise that can affect your community diversity, latitude and area. Species richness is going to be present more around the tropics. It's going to decline along the equatorial polar gradient. Factors that are going to play a role in that are your evolutionary history and your climate. Temperate polar communities have started over repeatedly as a result of glacial periods. The tropical environment's age might have a impact on the richness within their species and their growing seasons a little bit longer. So, climate is thought to be the primary cause of this gradient. Solar energy, water availability. We can look at those through evapotranspiration, which is looking at water evaporation from soil along with water transpiration from plants. Species area curve is saying that the area, the size that you have available, if you have a greater size, you're more likely to have more species. So here we see it with North American breeding birds. As the area increased, we have a greater number of species present. And other factors that are going to play a role with islands are going to be the size of the island, how far it is from the mainland, immigration, and emigration. What we see here is that basically they're going to reach a dynamic equilibrium point. So you can increase the richness of the species up to a point, but then it's going to level off. And what we've seen on this is that when you are on a small island versus a large island, you're going to have your equilibrium be at a smaller point than you would. You're going to have a smaller number of species than you would on a larger island. And we see that also with immigration and emigration. But we see that when you are closer to the mainland, you're going to have a greater number of species present, and that when you are, sorry, making sure I'm reading this right, and it's the same thing with extinction. So if you're closer to land, you're going to have more species that are going to be able to get over to these islands. Pathogens can alter your community structure both locally and globally. Examples of pathogens, disease-causing microorganisms, viruses, viroids, and prions. These can alter things very quickly and pretty extensively. So white band disease with coral reef communities, it's helping to chew those up. I looked into that a little bit more. They don't know specifically yet what the pathogen is. It's thought to be a bacteria, but it has not. They have not ascertained the identity of that pathogen at this time. Human activities are having a pretty big impact in transporting pathogens all over the world. And so this is one way community ecology might be able to be of benefit to study and combat them. Zoonotic pathogens are those that have been transferred from other animals to humans. The transfer could be direct or through an intermediate species called a vector. Many of the emerging human diseases are zoonotic, aka COVID-19. Being able to identify the community of hosts and vectors can help to prevent disease, which is what we've seen for the most part, that cats and dogs are not affected by COVID-19. Here's one example where they determined that two species of shrew tended to be found as the primary host for the Lyme disease pathogen, and that avian flu is going to be a very contagious virus for birds. So ecologists are studying the spread of this virus through migrating birds.